Okay, so today I'm going to be taking a closer look at the X-Files Sideshow Collectibles Frank Black action figure. Now, fans of the X-Files could be forgiven for wondering why on earth this character of all characters in the show, who only appears for one episode, gets his own figure. Especially as this series was fairly limited in the amount of characters it produced, and it overlooked an awful lot of important or integral recurring characters. And in order to answer that question, we kind of have to rewind the clock a little bit. And remember that the X-Files was a monstrous hit for television. The show initially ran for 9 consecutive seasons, and in between even had a movie. But by the time the show was already starting to enjoy its success in the first couple of seasons, the studio wanted another hit on their hands. They wanted a spin-off that they could also exploit in the hopes of having yet another hit on their hands. So they turned to producer Chris Carter and asked him to develop another television show. Carter quickly got to work and realised his first spin-off show, which would be Millennium. And this show would nicely complement the X-Files, whereas the X-Files focused on the more outlandish, supernatural and science fiction elements. Millennium instead would be much more grounded and deal with real-life horrors such as serial killers and really examine the nature of evil. And as the show progressed, it would introduce certain supernatural elements of its own. The other difference with this show is that it would focus on one central character, and that was Frank Black, who was wonderfully played by Lance Henriksen. However, the show did receive a mixed critical and commercial reaction. Its first season was certainly seen as being quite a lot darker than the X-Files, and this was unpalatable for certain viewers. And although the ratings were fairly strong and consistent throughout its first season, it was clear this wasn't going to be the mega hit that the studio was hoping for. By this point, the studio was already looking for other prospects, and Chris Carter started turning his attention to other TV shows that he could produce. As a result, Carter would hand the reins of the show over to other producers, who in its second season would take a radical different turn with the show. So radical, in fact, that by the time we get to the end of the second season, it has a very surprising and quite definitive end for the show, making things a little bit tricky for the renewed third season, which had brand new producers yet again. And once more, the direction, shape and feel of the show changed dramatically. And this third season, which would be its last, often felt uneven and that it was struggling to work out what it should be now. However, towards the end of the run, I think creatively it starts to find its path, but sadly, the show was cancelled. However, sadly, this time it felt like the show wasn't properly wrapped up. It felt like there wasn't closure for certain characters and that we never really got a satisfactory conclusion. So in honour of this, Chris Carter turned his attention back to the X-Files, and in the 7th season they produced a one-off episode called Millennium, which would bring Frank Black into the fold and try to tie up his story. And whilst this attempt never really feels satisfactory either, it is nice to have this character interact with Mulder and Scully, and firmly establish that they are indeed in the same universe. And interestingly, the legacy of Millennium is that it's a show that's really found more fans after it's been cancelled. People discovered it when it was re-released on DVD and in streaming services, and it seems to have grown its fan base over time than when it was initially aired on television. And there are many fans and indeed people who worked on the show who would have loved to have revisited it and done a special or a mini-series or something to really properly wrap up the show. And that is why Sideshow Collectibles chose Frank Black for their X-Files lineup. It makes perfect sense, it's an excellent choice, and I for one was really glad to get my hands on this figure, which to the best of my knowledge I think is the only Frank Black figure ever produced. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the figure itself. First of all, we have this wonderful cover, which of course has the actor's portrait there, we have the X-Files logo that we've seen, and underneath we have one of the stills from the opening title sequence. This is really attractive. I really love the green of the X as well. I think it's really vibrant, and this is very displayable, and I think just the artwork on this looks tremendous. The side panel shows the figure from a production photo, which looks really very nice, and again you can stack these figures next to each other in a line on your shelf and they look really presentable. Meanwhile, the reverse of the packaging again shows the figure in another action shot, and it has a little bit of information about Frank Black and the Millennium Group, which is kind of cool, and underneath we can see the other characters in this lineup. And when we open the front flap, we can see the figure in that window display there in all his glory, looking absolutely fantastic. And of course, on the left hand side, we have a little bit more information about the X-Files. And here he is straight out of the packaging. As you'd expect, the presentation of this character is really, really very good. The tailoring is of a very high standard, and it's visually quite impressive. Although his outfit is a little bit dull and not really spectacularly interesting, they've done a really nice job of producing it. And the head sculpt, I have to say, I think they've done a really good job of. I think, all the craggy lines are there. I think they've done a nice job with the hair. Now, obviously, this is the Season 3 or the X-Files version of Frank Black, where he has the grey hair rather than the first couple of seasons where he has dark hair. But I think you can instantly tell that this is Lance Henriksen. I think the likeness is really very strong here. The only caveat I have with it is that the right eye is a little bit odd. He's definitely looking off to the side like he's seen something fairly horrific, something's caught his attention. And I have fairly mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it's kind of cool because he does have an expression there. He's actually conveying a sense of horror or intrigue, which is entirely appropriate. On the other hand, it does look a little bit odd. Certainly, if you don't want him looking like that, if you want him looking directly at another figure or something like that, then yeah, that presents a few problems and it looks a little bit strange. The coat is made from a nice thick cotton material, so it feels quite durable, quite heavy as it should do, and I really like that they've opted for this coat because this is what he wears in his third season and of course in that X-Files episode, but it also looks remarkably similar to the one that he wears in the other 2 seasons as well. In particular, I like the detail of the collar, which is a leather effect just like in the show, so again it has that little bit of extra texture and is authentic, and I really like this little detail. I think it's really good. I really like the tailoring on it. I like how it has all these extra pockets. There's little sewn in areas there that should look like buttonholes, which is really cool. And he has obviously these little buttons in the top of his jacket and in some of his pockets there, which is really kind of nice. Now, some of these pockets, like these ones here, are actually functional, which is great. So you can put his hands in there or some of the extra bits and pieces if you want. But a lot of them are the false pockets. Now, when you open it up underneath, you can see he actually has his thick sort of fleece as well, which is really cool. And again, very different texture, very authentic, and it just looks really cool. Like, it just looks very, very much what you'd expect from the show, which is brilliant. Sideshow have also given him some really nice boots as well. Now, they are made of rubber, but they look like a cut above what we were seeing from Sideshow at this time, especially if we compare them to, say, some of the Bond figures, for example. There's a lot more detailing in here, and there's an awful lot more paint apps applied over them, so it really creates that worn leather effect, and it just looks really, really detailed and interesting, and I think they've done a really great job of this. In terms of articulation, it does of course employ the standard Sideshow mould, so he does have a ball jointed neck, meaning he can spin his head right the way around and look up and down a really good range of motion there, which is fantastic. He's got ball jointed shoulders, so of course his arms kick up and out there, and he can spin them right the way around, although you do have to persevere because that material in the coat is quite thick. He does have double jointed elbows, so if you want he can go all the way back there and scratch his head, which is pretty cool. He also has a swivel at the lower forearm as well, so he can spin his arm right the way around if you want him to, which is great. He's also got a sort of pin swivel at the wrist as well, so his hand can rotate 360 degrees, which is great, but he can also arc inwards and out as well, which is pretty cool. So a huge range of motion in these figures. It was pretty much standard for Sideshow at the time, but it's really, really effective. He's also got a upper torso joint as well, which allows him to spin from side to side and kind of lean forwards and back a little bit and kind of arch himself from side to side, which is pretty cool. He has ball jointed hips, so of course he can kick his legs out to the side. There's also an upper thigh swivel here as well, so it's difficult to see through the trousers, but he can spin his leg from side to side. He can kick his legs up and he can kick them all the way back, which is great. He's got double jointed knees there, so they can kick right the way backwards there. And here we can see the boot, and the articulation works even through the rubber boot, which is great. So he's got a swivel at the ankle there, but also he has a hinge as well, so he can kick his foot forwards and backwards. Sideshow have also been very generous when it comes to accessories, so he comes with his torch, his mobile phone, his Beretta, his other handgun, and a Millennium folder with 3 scene of the crime photos, which is really very, very cool. Nice little detail here, nice little touch, which I really appreciate. He also comes with his pager, which does date the show a little bit, but again, a nice little extra to have. The pager fits nice and easily onto his belt there. It's quite a snug fit, so there's no danger of it slipping off or falling away, which is pretty cool. He holds the folder fine in that left hand, but the grip doesn't feel quite tight enough to really feel quite secure with it, to be honest. So there is a little bit of balancing work going on. Again, when he's looking at the photographs here, you're playing with gravity a little bit to try and make this work for you, because his real grip in hand is his right hand. So anything that you want him to really snugly take a good grip of, he's going to be using that hand. So for example, if you want him to use his torch as he's got here, or his gun or his mobile phone, it's going to be this hand. And so long as you do that, then this hand holds everything perfectly well. It grips it nice and securely. There is those sort of flexible rubber fingers that they have, which is great. And you can see here how you can utilise that slightly askew glance that he has. So, here it looks like he's had a pretty horrific phone call. So I think you've always got to try and keep that in mind whenever you're trying to display this figure, really. You've got to take that into consideration. I thought I would point out that the Beretta is very nicely done. It is one of those where the chamber pulls back and forwards, which is very, very cool. As you can see, it just slides along there. I also like that there's two tones to this weapon, that we can see the brown on the grip of the weapon as well. Is really cool. And again, the detailing is pitch perfect. I love that the clip is removable, and of course it has the bullet at the top there as well, which is great, and just slides in and it stays in place perfectly. And of course he has no problems holding this weapon in his right hand whatsoever. It's a perfect fit. It fits very nicely into his grip, which is great, and of course his finger goes onto the trigger there as well, which is fab. So overall, I have to say I really, really love this figure. I think it's very nicely presented. I think the likeness is really strong. His accessories are really fun, and it's just wonderful to have a Frank Black figure on the market and have him in my collection. I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm really, really pleased to have him. Certainly, if I was going to criticise it, the only thing I can really nitpick is the eye, which isn't a game changer for me. I can live with it just fine. I think it works okay, but I can appreciate how many people might be frustrated by this, and yeah, certainly, like I said, it is a bit of work when you have to try and build that into the narrative of whatever display you're going to put him in. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.